It's the start of a brand new week of NUFC Transfer Daily, and in this episode we're going to be discussing two more European players who've been linked over the weekend, and also an update on Aston Villa's PSR situation, which could be handy for Newcastle in late June. Let's get into it. Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Thanks so much to everybody who supported me. As I keep saying, please like, share and subscribe if you haven't already, and also check out my Q&A that I did, bonus Q&A on Sunday, answering your questions on the current transfer landscape and what I think is going on behind the scenes at Newcastle. I'll link that in the description. If you haven't checked it out, please do. I'm going to be discussing two more European players who've been linked. Malick Fofana from Lyon, left-footed winger, and Giorgio Scalvini, centre-back from Atalanta, which is a very exciting link, but I'm going to talk about that and analyse why I'm not quite sure that one or either of them will end up happening. And we'll get straight into it by talking about Fofana, left-footed winger, linked over the weekend. There's a bunch of clubs linked with him. Obviously, he's been talked about mostly by Chelsea and Liverpool. Julien Laurent from ESPN said that other clubs, including Everton and Newcastle, have been interested. He definitely fits the bill in terms of a player of the right profile. 20 years old, 9 goals and assists in 29 games for Lyon last season, and a very, very exciting player. But left-footed, is that exactly what Newcastle need? On the right, probably not from what we think, but also I have mentioned across the videos and in yesterday's Q&A that we don't necessarily know what Eddie Howe's thinking. Perhaps he's looking at situations where he wants to change the way that the emphasis of the team in a similar way that he did when Sandro Tonali came in. If you remember, everybody wanted an out-and-out 6 who would allow Bruno to play higher up. As what's transpired this season, that's exactly what Tonali's brought, but actually he's more of a sort of 6-8 hybrid, actually a very similar player to Bruno in many ways, and it took time to sort of figure out how that would work. It would be sort of, I think, a similar situation with Fofana in that he wouldn't necessarily answer that question on that right-hand side. However, as I said, maybe there are different ways of doing things, and also he is very versatile. He can play on both sides and do different things, and also I think he can play down the middle as well. So it'll be really, really interesting to see if this one actually is of interest. I think, though, Chelsea are making a play, and I know I can already read the comments about Chelsea being interested in another player that Newcastle are linked with, but actually I think this is kind of, if anything, the opposite way round to the João Pedro deal, where Newcastle's name has come up. Chelsea have actually made a little bit more progress. Liverpool have also been linked as well. He would be an excellent player. He's very, very good, as you can see by these stats. Extremely good at carrying the ball, very good with touches, very heavily involved, getting the ball forward, progressive passes as well. The high percentiles for both of those, but he is still very raw as well, and he's very tricky. I think you could see him work quite well under Eddie Howe, but he doesn't strike me as the best option compared to some of the other players that we've looked at. We've looked at Magnus Akliouche, who I said yesterday I think Newcastle might well have in their back pocket. We've looked at Takefusa Kubo, we've looked at other players as well, João Pedro and Anthony Elanga, who would also be in that sort of forward line picture. Something very similar about all of these targets, I think, is that they can play across the board. They're very sort of good at different things. There's a high performance podcast episode coming out with Dan Byrne, I think today actually, where he talks about the different systems and the different setups and having different ways of playing and different patterns of play under Eddie Howe, and that's something that's been a very constant way that Eddie Howe has built this team. He's evolving it constantly. So he wants a squad that can do those things across the board. To me, it would still make sense for that right-hand side player to be a left-footed player, because inverted wingers on both sides would be something that we haven't seen, as I've said before, and would definitely be something I'd like to see at Newcastle, because, as I say, we have seen it slightly with Almiron and it really works, but two extremely good, exciting, high-ceiling players, I don't think we have seen that. I think Jacob Murphy's had a great season. Is he likely to repeat that? Not really, and as I say, he is right-footed. Just like Almiron's really great season that he had, he wasn't able to carry that on, and eventually sort of his career petered out at Newcastle. So I don't see this one currently being a big goer at this stage. I could be wrong. I still think they're very much putting feelers out for potential players. Obviously, they haven't really got past that with Elanga. They've only just really started to ramp up with João Pedro. That maybe is looking like the main target for this summer at this stage. But inquiries and questions, I think Newcastle are likely doing that with a lot of clubs. So I find it very, very hard to disbelieve this one in terms of as far as the report goes from Julien Laurent on ESPN that Newcastle have an interest, because I'm very, very sure that they have an interest in a lot of players. He's a very exciting player. The money that is apparently out there, 45-50 million for a 20-year-old, obviously that's younger than the actual band of 21 to 23. Is he quite experienced enough? He's had 2 years in the Lyon first team. The money, because of the interest, I think, although French football has money issues because of the TV rights deal, and Lyon obviously have well-documented financial issues. They've got things that might have that almost saw them relegated last season. But Liverpool and Chelsea and other clubs being interested, I think they're ramping the price up quite fairly, and I think it's unlikely to me that Newcastle will strike at that rate, especially when there's other clubs who are probably ahead in the queue at this stage. But we'll see how that goes. Let me know in the comment section if you would like to see Malick Fofana in a black and white shirt next season. And another player that's created a buzz in the fan base last night when it dropped, Giorgio Scalvini from Atalanta, right-footed centre-back who can play on the right-hand side. I've watched him for quite a number of years. I've spoken to people in Italy about him as well. And a note that comes back to me consistently is this sort of new Maldini tag, which is a huge sort of thing to say. And obviously he isn't ever going to be, I don't think, as good as Paolo Maldini, because I don't think anyone in the history of football defensively has ever been or will ever be as good as Paolo Maldini, in my humble opinion. But that's sort of the style of play, and I know he's on the other side. Crucially, I think these stats, I couldn't find any FB ref stats for him because he only played, I think, 6 games last season due to a horrific injury campaign. He got an ACL injury in June. Also earlier this year suffered a shoulder injury which kept him out for a number of months as well. So there's injury concerns there. But if you look at these stats from Total Football Analysis from a few years ago, again, just to really show you how the player would impact Newcastle and how he plays, not necessarily to show you how good he is. Look at the high ball recoveries. Look at the defensive positions. Extremely good at going and pressing the ball, counter pressing, getting a high line, and bringing the ball out from the back as well, and playing good passes forward. He reminds me a lot of what Sven Botman brought first time, and it would be very interesting to see if Newcastle could get the pair of them together, hypothetically. What that would do to the high line. You'd then have Tino Livramento at right back in an ideal world, Lewis Hall at left back in an ideal world, Scalvini and Botman. None of those have specifically lightning pace. This is something that I've said about the centre-back chase. That needs to really be somebody for me who is specifically very quick. Scalvini's thing is more about bringing the ball out, his positional play, and his intelligence, and he's extremely intelligent, very calm on the ball, very, very good all round. And I've spoken about European players and the money going further, and the high ceiling players you can get from clubs that aren't already elite, and Scalvini is a great example of that. He would definitely be along the lines of a Botman, of a Tonali, of a Bruno, of an Isak signing, that sort of level for me, because he's really that good in terms of his ability. As I say, those stats have really backed that up, but at the same time, the injury problems are there. If he signed, it would be 3 of the back 4 having cruciate knee ligament injuries. There is an argument that I've seen put on social media, which does make sense, that Newcastle did go and buy Tino Livramento in a very similar situation and maybe got him when his price had dipped because of that. I think if you're scouting the best defenders in Europe and the future up-and-coming players, you can't not have Giorgio Scalvini on your list. He's that good. So again, I would see this one as potential if the deal is there. I'm sure Newcastle would be interested in doing it because he is such a highly rated defender. But the injury record is a concern. And Atalanta have had a bit, similar to what I was saying about Tapsoba. Atalanta have had a bit of a sea change this summer. Gasperini's gone to Roma after about 9 or 10 years, and he was the real reason, I think, the driving force behind their success. The style of play that he brought, the high intensity, which again suits Scalvini and would mean that he would come into that from the Newcastle perspective quite easily. And Juric, the former Southampton manager, has gone to Atalanta, and I think that this is the time you would think that maybe there's an opportunity to strike for a player from that club, because the upward trajectory that they've been on is now a little bit clouded because Gasperini has left. I would say that is something at least worth looking at, but I do have doubts about this one because I just think that the injury situation, the money it would cost, and I think if he's available, other clubs will be interested as well. But we'll see how this one goes. As I say, it would be one of the best signings Newcastle could make this summer, and certainly a very, very exciting centre-back target if it's possible, if it's doable. But I do have my doubts on whether Scalvini will be playing for Newcastle next season. Again, let me know in the comment section below what you think of the idea of signing Giorgio Scalvini, because he's really, really excellent. Lots of comparisons with top Italian defenders. As I say, the best in Paolo Maldini has been sort of labelled at him for years, and although his progression has been stunted, he's only 21 still now. I think it would definitely be worth the risk whether Newcastle will take it. Let's see. As I say, they don't seem to have given up quite on Matt Gahey yet, because there's lots of talk about whether if he goes to Liverpool he'll start, and that he won't go to Liverpool if he won't start many games, so Newcastle may sense an opportunity to strike then, but we'll see on that in the coming weeks. Scalvini is a hugely interesting link, though. Came from Italy. I always do say that to take those with a pinch of salt, but I did say that about Tonali, and that turned out to be true. So let's see how this one plays out. It's a name that I think Newcastle will certainly have on their list, but we'll see where it goes. And the final thing I want to talk about is Aston Villa's PSR situation. I wasn't actually planning on talking about this before I sat down, but on The Athletic this morning, there's a really good article by their reporter Jacob Tanswell, who goes into detail about the PSR situation and who he thinks Villa should sell or could sell to close the gap. Apparently it's around £50 million, which puts them in a similar situation to what Newcastle were going into that June 30th deadline, because they missed out in the Champions League. Obviously, Newcastle have been linked with Jacob Ramsey. That would probably not solve the problem alone, but it would be pure profit, and they would be able to sell another squad player. So I think, as I've said in the Q&A yesterday, I said in a video last week, I think Ramsey is one to watch from Newcastle's perspective. I think that Eddie Howe really likes him. It would open the door to potentially replacing Joe Willock as well. Lots of people's dream would be Morgan Rogers. They're most likely to sign him onto a new contract because the article said his wages aren't particularly big. He's probably the player that I think that they're least willing to speak about. Boubacar Kamara would be an interesting one. As I say, another midfielder. Maybe you could then play Tonali a bit further on and put him next to Bruno. Maybe that would work, and bring in him as the sort of classic number 6. He's been excellent for Villa. Probably their best player last season, in my opinion, even though Rodgers and Tielemans took the plaudits. He was brilliant. 2 years on his contract as well, so this is the last year you would look at them getting a full FIFO. That would be interesting. Newcastle were interested in him pre his move to Villa as well. I'm not suggesting that that's possible or likely or even on the radar at all, by the way. I'm just riffing and basically looking at Villa's squad and suggesting players that Newcastle may look at. I don't think that they would be in a position to sign Rodgers. I don't think that they would look to sign Watkins, because although it would suit Newcastle's position of having another great striker, he's 29, he wants to play every week, and he wouldn't settle for the bench. You saw how frustrated he was when Marcus Rashford was taking his place at the back end of last season. So I would imagine that Newcastle will be in for Jacob Ramsey. We'll see how that plays out, but £50 million is apparently the shortfall for Villa, according to The Athletic this morning. Very good piece. If you haven't checked it out, go and do so, because it does make a lot of sense. Thanks so much for joining me anyway on today's episode of NUFC Transfer Daily. I'll be back tomorrow with another one. Catch you then. Cheers.